There is a deal sitting on the table in Ottawa right now, and it is not what it appears to be. On the surface, it looks like relief. It looks like Washington finally extending a hand after months of relentless economic pressure, offering Canada a way through the tariff wall that has been squeezing Canadian workers, farmers, and manufacturers since the very beginning of this confrontation. But look more carefully at the precise conditions attached to that offer, and a very different picture emerges. This is not an olive branch. This is a trap constructed with enough surface plausibility to be genuinely mistaken for generosity, and the price of accepting it is the deliberate and irreversible dismantling of something Canada spent the last year building with extraordinary strategic care, at considerable political cost, and with a level of patience that Washington clearly did not anticipate and may not have fully accounted for even now as it formulates its next move. Here is what you need to understand before anything else. The Trump administration has been operating on a clear and internally consistent theory for months. The theory is straightforward. Apply sufficient economic pressure, let the pain accumulate in the industries that matter most politically, wait for the business community to demand relief, and the political will to resist to collapse under the weight of that accumulated demand. And eventually, the target country will realign itself with Washington's economic agenda. That playbook has worked before in other contexts and with other governments. That is what was supposed to happen to Canada, but Canada did not fold. And so Washington made its move. According to sources cited by major international news organizations, including Global News and Reuters, the Trump administration is now signaling what it describes as conditional exemptions for Canada. Real tariff relief, meaningful tariff relief, numbers that would genuinely ease the economic pressure on Canadian industries that have been absorbing damage for months. But attached to that relief is a condition that Prime Minister Mark Carney never publicly agreed to, and that the Canadian government may find both structurally and politically impossible to accept without catastrophic consequences for its own credibility. The condition is this: Canada must apply the exact same tariffs on Chinese steel and electric vehicle batteries that the United States currently applies. Not similar tariffs, not broadly comparable tariffs, identical ones, calibrated to the American schedule, enforced on the American timeline, with the full American strategic logic embedded in every provision. And to understand why that condition is so extraordinarily significant, you need to understand what accepting it would require Canada to walk away from. In January of 2026, Carney flew to Beijing and signed a trade agreement that rebuilt years of broken and deeply damaged diplomatic relationships in a single, carefully orchestrated visit. Under that agreement, Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola dropped from 84% down to approximately 15%, reopening one of the largest agricultural markets on Earth to Canadian farmers who had been locked out completely for years. In exchange, Canada lowered its tariff on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to 6.1%, with an initial cap of 49,000 vehicles per year, a carefully calibrated and deliberate signal of genuine commercial openness rather than a sudden, uncontrolled flood of Chinese imports into the Canadian market. Washington's demand, if accepted in its current form, would require Canada to tear that agreement apart, to communicate to Beijing that the relationship Canada spent years deliberately rebuilding is being abandoned under American instruction. That is not a trade negotiation offering mutual benefit. That is an ultimatum wearing the costume of a compromise and carrying the weight of a threat. Stay with me because the full dimensions of what is actually happening here go considerably deeper than any tariff number, and the most critical part of this story is precisely the part that almost no major analysis is currently engaging with seriously. Washington's reaction to the Beijing deal when it was first announced made the underlying agenda perfectly clear. Threats of 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods arrived almost immediately, followed within days by a suggestion from Trump himself that the deal was actually a positive development, followed by the return of the threats within days of that suggestion. Three completely contradictory positions within 11 days. That pattern of deliberate instability was not random, and it was not confused messaging. It was the precise reason Carney had pursued an independent relationship with Beijing in the first place. The conventional framing of this confrontation is fundamentally wrong, and it is worth taking a careful moment to explain exactly why, because the frame being used almost everywhere right now is determining which questions analysts are asking and which equally important questions are remaining completely invisible. The dominant frame is bilateral. Washington applies pressure and Ottawa decides how to respond. Strong or weak, comply or resist, accept the deal or reject it. That is the lens through which nearly every analyst, every commentator, and every editorial board is currently examining this situation. And it is the wrong lens entirely. Begin with a different and more revealing question. Not what Canada should do in response, but why Washington is making this specific move at this specific moment, not 6 months ago when the tariff pressure was newer and the political pain was fresher and Canadian resistance was less established, and not 6 months from now when the situation would have had more time to develop organically in either direction. Why now? The original theory behind the tariff strategy rested on a specific and internally optimistic timeline. Economic pain would overcome Canadian political will before Canada's diversification strategy could produce enough tangible and visible results to demonstrate that a genuine alternative to near total American economic dependence was actually achievable and not merely rhetorical. The Canadian business community would demand alignment with Washington before alternative trade relationships became sufficiently established to provide a real and durable economic buffer. The political cost of continuing to resist American pressure would exceed the political cost of conceding before the emerging architecture of Canadian strategic independence became too deeply embedded in real economic relationships to dismantle without causing enormous disruption. That timeline is not playing out as Washington anticipated, and the evidence for that assessment is accumulating across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Foreign direct investment into Canada is running at levels not seen in nearly 2 decades. Trade and security partnerships have been concluded across multiple continents within a single year of deliberate diplomatic effort. Canadian exports to non American markets are rising. The global investment and business community is not treating Canada as an economy under existential stress. It is treating Canada as an economy with genuine strategic value and long term structural stability in an increasingly uncertain and fragmented global environment. Every month that passes with investment continuing to flow in, with new trade agreements adding to the accumulated total, with Canadian exports finding new destinations beyond the American market, the tariff threat loses a meaningful fraction of its total leverage over Canadian decision making. The tariffs are still causing real and serious pain for real workers and real businesses in steel, aluminum, and automotive sectors across multiple Canadian provinces. That reality is not in dispute, and it would be analytically dishonest to minimize it. But the political will inside Canada to absorb that pain and continue absorbing it has proven considerably more durable than Washington's strategic model predicted when the tariff campaign was first designed. The conditional exemption offer represents Washington attempting to reset the clock and the leverage calculation before Canada's alternative economic architecture becomes too established and too embedded in genuine commercial relationships to dismantle with a single diplomatic ultimatum. The timing of this offer is not coincidental and it is not random. In negotiations of this complexity, the timing of every significant move is always strategic. Understanding the logic behind the timing is the essential key to understanding what this offer actually represents and what Canada's response to it will mean for the years ahead. The United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer made the underlying strategic logic explicit in testimony before a congressional committee. His words, not a paraphrase or interpretation, were that Canada is doubling down on globalization at precisely the moment Washington is trying to correct for the accumulated problems of globalization. Read that statement carefully because it is not a complaint about steel dumping or an expression of concern about specific supply chain security vulnerabilities. It is a statement about two fundamentally incompatible and mutually exclusive visions of how the global economy should be organized in the decades ahead. And Canada is sitting at the exact intersection of those two visions right now, forced to make decisions that will define its position in the emerging global economic architecture for a generation. Now, here is the dimension of this story that is almost entirely absent from mainstream coverage, and it is precisely the dimension that makes this confrontation genuinely consequential for countries that have no direct stake in Canadian or American bilateral trade policy. There is a third player sitting at this table, and almost no serious analysis is examining what this moment looks like from Beijing, what Beijing's actual strategic interests are in each of the possible outcomes currently under consideration, and why the structural logic of this confrontation means that Beijing stands to benefit significantly and in different ways, regardless of which direction Canada ultimately moves. When Carney flew to Beijing in January of 2026 and signed that agreement, it was not simply a commercial transaction between two governments seeking mutual economic benefit. It was a deliberate and very public signal to every government watching the situation carefully, and many governments around the world were watching very carefully, that a G7 nation could independently negotiate and conclude a significant commercial relationship with China without first seeking Washington's explicit permission or even ensuring Washington's advance awareness. That is a statement considerably larger in its strategic implications than the canola numbers alone would suggest. That is a statement considerably larger than the electric vehicle tariff percentages in isolation. For Beijing, that agreement represented something it has been working to demonstrate for years against sustained Western institutional resistance, that the unity of Western governments on China policy is not as unconditional and structurally ironclad as it is officially and repeatedly presented to be, that individual nations, when facing genuine economic pressure and genuine economic opportunity, will ultimately make decisions based on their own national interests rather than on pure collective alignment with alliance-wide strategic priorities. Now, consider carefully what happens if Canada is forced to abandon that Beijing agreement under sustained American pressure. If Ottawa walks back the deal because Washington demanded it through the mechanism of conditional tariff relief, Beijing receives a powerful, exportable, and highly credible narrative. The narrative is direct. Canada tried to exercise independent commercial judgment based on its own national interests. Washington applied sustained economic pressure until Canada reversed course and abandoned its independent judgment. This is what exercising independent judgment actually costs you when you are inside the Western alliance system and Washington disapproves of your choices. That narrative does not remain contained within Canada's borders. It travels immediately and effectively to the governments of Southeast Asia, of Africa, of Latin America, of the Middle East, where leaders are making their own continuous calculations about how closely to align with Washington, at what economic cost, and with what lasting consequences for their own commercial relationships with Beijing. On the other hand, and this is the scenario that produces genuine discomfort in Washington's strategic planning, if Canada holds firm and the diversification strategy continues generating tangible and verifiable results, Beijing has a completely different demonstration available. A living and functioning proof of concept that a fully Western-aligned nation can pursue genuinely independent economic relationships with China and successfully withstand considerable American pressure to abandon them. Either outcome advances Beijing's broader strategic argument. The fact that both possible outcomes serve Beijing's interests in different but significant ways is the third dimension of this story that serious analysis cannot responsibly ignore. United States Trade Representative Greer's congressional testimony captured the underlying logic of Washington's position in a way that strips away any ambiguity about what this confrontation is actually about at its deepest structural level. His statement that Canada is doubling down on globalization when Washington is trying to correct for the problems of globalization is not a trade complaint in the conventional sense. It is a declaration of two incompatible worldviews competing for dominance, and Canada, by virtue of its geography, its history, and its economic structure, finds itself positioned at the precise intersection of those competing visions, unable to fully belong to either one without permanently sacrificing meaningful elements of its sovereignty and its economic future to whichever side it ultimately chooses. Washington's demand specifically targets the Canada China Agreement rather than addressing any other aspect of Canadian trade policy, and that specificity is not accidental. There is a structural paradox sitting at the very heart of Washington's current strategic approach toward Canada, and it deserves to be named and examined directly because it reveals something fundamental about the internal contradiction embedded in the conditional exemption offer and about the deeper tension that has come to define American policy toward its northern neighbor throughout this confrontation. Prime Minister Carney has never closed the door on deeper North American economic integration. The concept of a jointly protected economic zone giving both countries genuine preferential access to each other's markets while presenting a unified and coherent commercial and strategic front to the rest of the world is something Ottawa has explicitly and publicly stated it remains genuinely open to exploring. That openness is real. It is documented in multiple on the record statements from senior Canadian government officials, and it is not a negotiating performance designed to appear reasonable while concealing a harder and less cooperative underlying position, but a jointly protected economic zone of the kind that would meaningfully advance both countries' interests, what some policy analysts have called Fortress North America, only functions as a durable and genuinely effective arrangement if both partners trust each other sufficiently to build something lasting together across administrations and through changes in political leadership. It requires a foundation of predictability, of stated positions that remain consistent, of a partner whose publicly expressed commitments do not reverse themselves multiple times within a single fortnight in response to social media dynamics and shifting domestic political pressures. And by applying this kind of ultimatum style pressure through the mechanism of conditional tariff relief, by making demands that require Canada to dismantle the very diversification architecture that demonstrates Canadian strategic independence and that establishes Canada's credibility as a reliable and autonomous partner to other nations around the world, Washington may be actively and systematically undermining the essential preconditions necessary for the deeper integration it simultaneously claims to want from Canada over the long term. That is not a minor or incidental irony. That is a structural contradiction operating directly at the center of American trade strategy toward Canada, and it is producing real costs that are not appearing in any quarterly economic report. The people bearing the weight of that contradiction are not the officials sitting in the negotiating rooms in Washington or the cabinet ministers deliberating in Ottawa. They are the auto worker in Windsor, whose plant runs on cross-border supply chains that existing tariffs are actively disrupting on a monthly basis. They are the steel worker in Hamilton watching profit margins compress and employment security deteriorate under sustained tariff pressure. They are the farmer in Saskatchewan who spent years completely locked out of Chinese agricultural markets and who finally, in early 2026, watched those doors open through Carney's deliberate diplomatic effort, who subsequently invested and planned and made financial commitments accordingly, and who is now watching Washington demand that Ottawa slam those doors permanently shut again to satisfy an American strategic preference that Farmer had no voice in formulating. That Farmer is not an abstraction in a geopolitical framework. That is a person whose livelihood and long-term financial security sits at the precise intersection of a great power chess match they never asked to participate in and were never meaningfully consulted about. The geopolitical architecture being negotiated at the highest levels produces very specific and very material consequences at the level of individual lives and individual livelihoods. Three things are being decided simultaneously in this confrontation, and understanding all three together is essential to understanding the genuine weight of what is actually at stake in the outcome. The auto worker in Windsor, the steel worker in Hamilton, and the farmer in Saskatchewan are the human reality beneath all of this geopolitical architecture. The decisions being made in Washington and Ottawa and Beijing will shape their daily economic lives in ways that no quarterly report will capture completely, and that no diplomatic communique will describe with full honesty. The three things being decided simultaneously in this confrontation are the future shape of North American economic integration, the viability of allied nations maintaining meaningful economic sovereignty within American-led security frameworks, and the cost of ordinary life for ordinary people who never asked to be positioned at the center of a defining contest between competing models of global economic organization. Every analysis of this situation from every serious commentator and publication is asking the same question and framing it in exactly the same binary terms. Will Canada accept the deal or reject it? That is the frame. Accept or reject, but that frame is the wrong question entirely, and asking the wrong question produces analysis that cannot be genuinely useful for understanding where this situation actually goes or what the realistic range of outcomes actually looks like. The right question is what Canada's counteroffer actually looks like and what leverage Carney brings to that conversation that he did not possess 12 months ago when this confrontation was just beginning to take its current shape. Three scenarios represent the realistic range of what happens next, and each carries a different set of costs, benefits, and long-term implications. The first scenario is sectoral alignment. Canada agrees to restrict specific and carefully defined categories of Chinese goods, not the comprehensive alignment Washington is publicly demanding in its current form, but a targeted and negotiated list, certain steel grades, certain battery input components, enough to give Washington a political result it can credibly describe to its domestic audience as meaningful progress while preserving the agricultural dimensions of the Beijing Agreement that matter most to Canadian farmers, to rural Canadian communities, and to the political coalition that Carney requires to sustain his government through continued external pressure. This is the most transactional path currently available, and it reflects how most complex international negotiations historically conclude. Both sides accept something meaningfully less than their stated opening position, and both sides subsequently find language to describe the outcome to their respective domestic audiences as a success that advanced their core interests. The second scenario is the security carve-out. Canada proposes a formal and legally structured separation between security cooperation and commercial trade policy, deep and explicitly documented alignment with Washington on defense commitments, intelligence sharing arrangements, critical mineral supply partnerships, and sensitive technology cooperation, paired with equally explicit and formally recognized national autonomy on independent commercial trade relationships with third countries, including China. This is a structurally more ambitious counterproposal, and it asks Washington to accept a conceptual distinction that the current administration has demonstrated very limited appetite for accepting in any negotiating context. But it is precisely the counter that several of Canada's allies, particularly in Europe, where governments face structurally analogous pressures from Washington on their own China commercial relationships, might quietly and actively support because it creates a reusable template that they themselves would want access to. The third scenario is the long game. Canada refuses to dismantle what it has methodically constructed over the last year, absorbs the continued economic pain in the sectors most directly exposed to American tariffs, keeps building the alternative trade and investment architecture that is already producing measurable results in real markets, and makes a calculated strategic bet that 12 months from now, the leverage calculation will look meaningfully different. This path carries the highest risk and the highest potential reward, but it requires something no geopolitical strategy or diplomatic sophistication can manufacture. It requires patience from ordinary people paying real and immediate prices for a long-term bet made on their behalf. What is ultimately being tested in this negotiation is not merely Canada's trade relationship with two major economic powers. It is a foundational question about whether meaningful economic sovereignty remains achievable for integrated economies in a world organized increasingly around great power competition and enforced alliance conformity. Two models are competing directly: hard block alignment, where protection comes at the cost of sovereign economic independence, and sovereign diversification, where independence is maintained at the price of friction with the dominant power in your alliance. The result of this confrontation will echo through every capital watching and drawing its own conclusions about which model can survive sustained pressure and which one cannot. The human dimension underneath all of this geopolitical architecture is the dimension that ultimately determines which of the three scenarios becomes reality, because diversification strategies are straightforward to announce and politically rewarding to describe in visionary terms. The result will be studied and debated for years.